in Brazil. To us, with both the embassy and consulates in Brazil, it is a pleasure to organize this online panel to share information about the U.S. electoral system. As the two largest democracies in our hemisphere, both Brazil and the U.S. both deeply value the electoral process and the right of all citizens to have their voice heard. I believe that this is a very good opportunity to discuss the American electoral system, which is different from the Brazilian one. As you all know,
Estados Unidos acontecem em 3 de novembro, enquanto boa parte do foco,
while most of the focus will of course be on the presidential race, it is important to highlight that Americans will also be voting to elect state, county, and local officials, as well as voting on popular referenda on a host of issues. Through programs such as this, we encourage the exchange of knowledge and ideas between Americans and Brazilians, so we can learn from each other and grow together as stronger democracies. Both our countries have and will continue to be partners in support of democracy and democratic principles across the region and beyond. Before we start our panel, I would like to thank the fundamental partnership of the Federal University of Minas Gerais through the Center for North American Studies. Representing this partnership today, we have Professor Dawson Lopez, Deputy Director of International Relations and Professor of the Department of Political Sciences at the UFMG, who kindly accepted our invitation to be the moderator of this panel. I also want to thank Professor Bruno Reis, Director of the Faculty of Philosophy and Humanities at UFMG, and a member of the Center for North American Studies, who will participate as a debater. Our keynote speaker from the US is Professor Akram Elias, who will explain the dynamics of federalism in the American electoral system. Professor Elias, thanks for your participation with us today. I now pass it to the moderator so that he can introduce our speaker and we can begin with tonight's program. Thank you.
On 2020 US presidential elections. And I thank US embassies and consulates to Brazil for this very prestigious invitation. Well, there's only one more month to go until November the 3rd. And as we get closer to election day, plenty of issues arise. Who will be in charge of the White House for the coming 4 years? Democrats, Republicans? Brazilians seem to be more interested than ever in America's political process. However, the understanding of US political institutions, and namely electoral procedures, is not a trivial task. Questions abound. There are many doubts with regard to the functioning of US democracy. What and whom exactly does the Electoral College represent? How is the weight of each American federal state defined? Can there even be a situation where counted popular votes do not coincide with overall election results? These and many other topics will be covered during this conversation. And luckily for us, it happens just the day after the incumbent President Donald Trump and his challenger, Joe Biden, have made an appearance on TV to debate over the future of the United States. So let's talk the US elections. For that, I may rely on a very distinguished pair of experts. For the first 25 minutes or so, Mr. Akram Elias will have the floor and give his views. Mr. Elias is the founder and president of Capital Communications Group, a company that focuses on public diplomacy, federalism, political relations, cross-cultural communications, and international business networking. Elias has worked extensively with cultural exchange programs and frequently presents briefings on American government, politics, culture, and society to international delegates from around the world. Then Professor Bruno Reis will play the role of the discussant and react to Elias' presentation for approximately 10 minutes. Professor Reis is the current Dean of UFMG's School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Democracy, political institutions, and elections fall within his fields of expertise. After these two interventions, there will be some time for Q&A, and I strongly encourage each and everyone to make comments, send questions, and engage in a fruitful dialogue. With no further delay, I now invite Mr. Elias to have the floor. Mr. Elias, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for this wonderful introduction, and I am so pleased to be with you all and to speak to our Brazilian friends. Please call me Akram. I'm going to spend about 20-25 minutes, walk you through the process of elections in the United States, the mechanics, the dynamics of it, and hopefully set the stage for a rich, conversation. There were a lot of interesting statements and questions raised by Professor Lopez, so I'm looking forward to really having an exchange around those. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you all to help us navigate through my presentation. And Julie, may I have a thumb up? Can you see it? Perfect. All right, so let me do this. And again, welcome everyone. And let me start with first laying out the foundation. I know many of you are familiar with the fact that our system of government is non-centralized and decentralized. There are many similarities between our system in the United States and yours in Brazil, but I'd like to focus on few points because there are also some distinctions. As you can see, we have 3 levels of government. The one in the middle that I have highlighted here in red is the cornerstone. That is the key thing to keep in mind. This is the basic unit, my dear Brazilian friends. So everything starts from the state level. And you notice I got an arrow pointing upward towards what we call the federal government. Federal government, US government, American government, they mean exactly the same thing. Why? Because the US government is not a national central government. We've never had a national central government, and we don't want to see one, to be quite honest with you. So we call the US government a federal entity. The federal government, I'm going to expand on it in a few moments, but it is an entity created and managed by the states. So the states dictate upwardly through a Congress every 2 years and through a president every 4 years how the federal government is to operate, what to do, and why to do it. Then the 50 states have decentralized. So instead of having things centralized in the capital of each one of the 50 states, the 50 states decentralized by delegating power to their local communities. Today, we have more than 89,000 local governments. That means tens of thousands of locally elected legislative branches, tens of thousands of local executive branches whose heads are locally elected, selected, thousands and thousands of judicial branches, etc. So I'm laying the foundation before we start hitting the elections. Julie mentioned to you, people are voting on November 3rd, but they're voting on many things. So let's dig deeper into this. Now, first question to keep in mind is, why do we have a federal government? In other words, why aren't we 50 separate countries? Simple. 13 original founding states, former British colonies, decided to form a union of states instead of becoming 13 countries for one very important reason: sovereignty. They came up with a new construct of sovereignty, saying sovereignty doesn't have to be done state, country by country. Sovereignty can be collective, as long as the collective governs it. So it took them about 13 years to come up with the federal system that we have in existence still today in the United States. Yes, many things have evolved. Processes have changed. We elect more people than we used to. We had slavery in this country, horrible cancer. We went through horrible civil war to get rid of it. Then we had a system of segregation, all kinds of things. America has evolved. Civil society today is much more complex and powerful and effective than it was 240 some years ago. But the structure, the basic foundation of the federal system remains almost intact. So the very important reason for creating the US government, and I call these the sovereign powers. There are 4 public policy domains, my dear friends, and I'm gonna use here words that are very important to understand American federalism. These 4 public policy areas, the 50 states must govern them always together, never separately, and only federally. And they are in order of importance: the defense of the Union. So the 50 states organize a Congress every 2 years to do, first and foremost, develop the legislation to govern the policy and adopt a budget to govern the defense of their union. Second is monetary policy, the governance of the dollar. Third is world affairs. So that includes all kinds of relations between the United States and the rest of the world. Things like foreign policy, things like, international trade agreements, international conventions like human rights or combating human trafficking. It also includes like access to the United States, so visa entry, duties, tariffs when it comes to trade, etc. Last is to regulate commerce among the 50 states, because we have literally 50 economies, 50 free markets, 50 taxation systems, 50 separate budgetary systems. And when you create a business in the United States, you incorporate at the state level. Please forget the US government. Please forget it. So all these 50 economies now need to trade with one another. We want free trade. So therefore, interstate commerce must be regulated federally. So what happens to everything else? You can see on the right of the screen. I don't have to read it to you. Basically what it says, anything that is not one of these 4, hey, my friends from Brazil, I don't care what it is, and I surely don't care what the future may bring. If it is not one of these 4, that becomes immediately, automatically, the fundamental responsibility of the 50 state governments, not the US government. So when you think of education, healthcare, internal security, agriculture, energy, economic development, urban planning, environmental protection, I don't care. Do not think US government first. I beg you, think California, Texas, Iowa, New Hampshire, Michigan first. That brings me now to the second very important, I'm going to talk about it, why the second important reason the US government has been created. But first and foremost is to have these. So now, what is the second very important reason? Today, I can assure you that the 50 states collaborate federally in every policy domain outside of the sovereign powers. They collaborate in education, in environment, in healthcare. But you're gonna understand why this whole debate about Obamacare. Why? But because this is part of the shared power. So if, and notice here the condition, if states wish to collaborate federally in any policy domain outside of the 4 sovereign ones, they can, but under 2 conditions. Condition 1, they must agree through a Congress to such federal collaboration. If they don't agree, it cannot happen. And second, how do they collaborate federally without centralizing? In other words, without ending up with national centralized systems for education, for health, for energy, etc. This is the eternal, constant debate that every generation of Americans has to go through. So why do the 50 states collaborate federally? I'm mentioning here 4 very important reasons. First one, fundamental, is rights. So now you understand why we had that ugly history of apartheid. We called it segregation in the United States. Before 1964, if I were a Black American and living in New York, I'd be treated one way, and I go to a place like Alabama and I would be treated like a dog. How can that be within the same country? Well, welcome to federalism. Civil rights is not defense, it's not monetary, it's not one of the 4. So each state regulated civil rights its own way. And while some states combated discrimination, other states institutionalized it. So what happened in 1964? The Congress of the United States established the Federal Civil Rights Act. So by adopting a federal law in the area of rights, the 50 states, since they adopted it through their Congress, they impose it on themselves as a minimum protection. Each state now can provide higher protection, but not no longer lower protections. Second very important reason is access. Citizens need to have access to public services, to public institutions. So I'm picking an example here, the Americans with Disabilities Act, because this year we're commemorating or celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act that was adopted in 1990. So, for example, before 1990, if I were someone on a wheelchair and I wanted to go up or down a sidewalk anywhere in this country, access to a bathroom, elevator, garage spaces, public buildings, well, it varied from place to place. So how can I be free and independent as a citizen and not have to count on the charity of others unless I had that minimum access? That is what the 1990 ADA did, and the entire infrastructure of the 50 states had to change to accommodate people with disabilities because they passed it through their Congress, so they impose it on themselves. Third very important reason is federal standards. We need standards in education, environmental protection, healthcare. Welcome to the debate over Obamacare. What should be those minimum standards and minimum access? We don't have a national centralized educational system, no national curriculum, no national graduation exam, forget it. But we need minimum standards. Welcome to the role of Congress every 2 years in establishing, raising, calibrating those standards. And last reason is to use parts of the federal budget to invest in research and development, in doing capacity building, what I call shared investments. This is important. Each state brings its own priorities through the Congress. Some states want budget, for example, for infrastructure, others for agriculture, others for, education. And then they negotiate among themselves, and every state gets something that creates more interdependency among the 50 states through the federal budget. Now, quick, state government. 50 states, think of them almost like 50 countries. So we have 50 constitutions, 50 flags, 50 state legislatures. They are elected by the people of each state. By the way, look at here, I'm calling them almost like equivalent to 50 national parliaments, because Congress is not a national parliament. Our union is very different from the European Union. There is no American parliament. Congress is a conference of states, by states, and for states. And if you're not one of the 50 states, you are not welcome to have voting delegates to the Congress. This explains to you why territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, the District of Columbia do not have those voting delegates, senators and representatives, because they are not really states. So parliaments for us are what we call state legislatures, and there are the 50 states. So 50 legal systems, 50 heads of state, governors. By the way, governors are not only elected directly by the people of each state, they receive no orders from the President of the United States, and they report nothing to the President of the United States. It's a vertical separation of power. And 50 judicial branches with 50 Supreme Constitutional Court. So since we're talking about elections, this explains to you the diversity of election systems. States control these, my dear friends. So here in New Hampshire, governor is elected to 2 years. In Michigan, 4 years. Look at their state legislatures. Attorney General is the equivalent of a minister of justice in countries around the world. Well, in New Hampshire, that person is appointed. In Michigan, that person is elected by the people. Same for state judges. Think almost 50 countries with 50 election systems and processes and regulations, because we have 50 criminal and civil legal systems. Something legal in one state may be criminal in another state. That explains to you why New York does not have the death penalty, for example, why Alabama does. So what is happening elections-wise on November 3rd, my dear friends? Well, we have tens of thousands of elections going on the same day across the country. So in other words, people go to vote, they're voting on all these things at once. Local chief executives, local legislators, trial courts, boards. Let me tell you something about, for example, local boards. Take school boards. Because public education is not centralized in the United States, the 50 states delegated it to their local governments. 90% of the local boards of education in the United States are elected. My wife and I elect that board every 4 years. That board, locally elected in partnership with us, establishes educational policy locally. We set the budget, the program, etc. Then people are voting also on elections having to do with their state government. We have 11 governors, basically governorships up for election out of the 50 on November 3rd. We have 49 of the 50 states that have a system of parliament with 2 chambers, like a House and a Senate. Only one state, Nebraska, has 1 chamber. So total 99 chambers, legislative chambers. Well, 86 of those have elections. And now think, education, health, you know, the day-to-day life is mainly under what? State government control. Yes, there is federal collaboration, but the main work is happening at the state and local level. So you can imagine how important these elections are, and look at all the judges here that are also up seats for election. Now, what about the federal? So let's talk a little bit about the federal government, because I know that's what most people are interested in. Well, we manage our union through a Congress, as I mentioned. Every 2 years, the 50 states convene a Congress of themselves in Washington, D.C. Once the 2 years end, the Congress is dissolved. So come January 3rd, 2021, next year, there will be a new Congress for 2 years. It will set its own agenda. That can be very different from the previous Congress, depending on who gets elected to that Congress. Okay, so the Congress is made up of 2 chambers. One is called the House of Representatives, the other one is the Senate. The key thing to keep in mind is that these 2 chambers, the House and the Senate, are separate and equal to each other in 2 key powers: the power to make federal law and the power to adopt the budget of the US government. No one is above the other. So you always need a majority in the House and a majority vote in the Senate to have any legislation passed and sent to the president. No dollar can be taxed on the American people, on US corporations, on any entity in the United States to fund the US government, not $1, until and unless majority in the House, majority in the Senate agree using the same exact language, and not $1 can be spent by the president, not one, unless and until majority in the House, majority in the Senate appropriate the budget to the president. Once the president gets the budget, he has some room to maneuver in how he spends it when it comes to certain items, but he cannot spend until and unless he gets authorized with a budget. So now, representatives are elected 2 years directly by the people of each state, proportional to the size of population. So we have a total of 435 representatives. In the Senate, however, each state has 2 senators. So big California, the most populous state in our country, which has 53 representatives here, has only 2 senators, like tiny Montana. 50 states, 100 senators. So why am I calling them rule of the states and rule of the people? Simple, my friends, simple. This is important for you to understand so you can better understand why we elect the president the way we do. The House is the rule of the people, which means in order to get a majority vote in the House, we must have the majority of the people, because representation in the House is proportional to population. But in the Senate, to get a majority vote, we do not need the majority of the people. We must have the majority of the states. And the idea behind it, we need the majority of the states and the majority of the people to agree. Checks and balances between the rule of the states and the rule of the people. Why? To help us avoid as much as possible and prevent as much as possible separatist movements and rebellions. We like to keep the country united without secessionist movements. Otherwise, states, big states like California would monopolize the union, and states like Montana start thinking about separating. We don't want that. So keep that in mind. It's a system of checks and balances between the rule of the states and the rule of the people, because we're not the Republic of the People of America, and we're not the Republic of America either. We're the Republic of the United States of America. Now, there are obviously some powers exclusively to the Senate, others to the House. You can see them. Most importantly, for a president, the Senate controls his appointments and has greater control over certain aspects of foreign policy, like negotiating international treaties. Now, here's the president. President is partnering with the Congress to manage the union. So the president is elected separately. By whom? We're going to talk about it. By the states, not the people, because he's president of the United States. 4 years, got 2 terms, consecutive terms as a limit. His power, he has the veto to balance the Congress. Why? Because he has no right to introduce legislation into the Congress. The Congress is not a parliament. The veto is used by the president in order to force Congress to start negotiating with him. It's all about negotiating. Welcome to divided, separate, equal branches of government, as we call them. He has tremendous executive powers once he and the Congress agree on anything. Congress does not micromanage the execution by the president. So here, very important. In federal elections, welcome to primaries and caucuses. I want to say something here important, because civil society plays the most important role in the selection of each nominee of political parties in our country. I don't know how many of you know, but we have 216 political parties. 216 people think of Democrats and Republicans. I hope we'll have questions about that, and I'll explain why Democrats and Republicans dominate the political landscape in our country at the national level. But in the United States, the party leaderships do not produce party lists. They don't choose themselves their official candidates. individuals run for office. They claim the brand of a party. They don't ask permission. If Donald Trump were to ask permission from the leadership of the Republican Party of this country to run for the presidency, trust me, he would have never seen the White House. They hated his guts back in 2016. And if Barack Obama were to ask permission to be the nominee of the Democratic Party in 2008, he would have never seen the White House. Not because they hated him, because of Bill Clinton. He had so much power in the leadership of the party. Hillary Clinton would have been the nominee. In the primary, citizens run for office, seeking support of civil society groups. We have more than 2 million civil society groups in our country, okay? So in education, health, environment, citizens are expected to take the initiative to shape public policy, not government. They are supposed to do that using advocacy, lobbying. They partner with government to get the policies they want. Welcome to open government, the Open Government Act of 2007, to open public hearings. No legislation can be made without engaging in that partnership. And of course, they even play a role in elections by being election judges, election monitoring, etc., etc. Amazing. Quick here, my friends. So now that you got it, we're almost done. The President of the United States, therefore elected by the states, not the people. But remember, we need the checks and balances, rule of the people and rule of the states. If the people were to elect the president, what would happen? You know what would happen? Take 2016. I am sure most of you have heard how Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, received more than 3 million votes than Donald Trump in the presidential election of 2016. So where did the 3 million votes come from? Hello, more than 2 million from one state, California. In other words, if the people elected directly the president, a state like California would monopolize the presidency. What would we have? Back to separatist movements. So even at the level of the presidency, we had the system brings the checks and balances. Some people like it, some people hate it, but that's the system it is, checks and balances. President of the United States. So people vote, citizens vote in each state, and they, by voting, they order their state whom to elect. And in each state has a number of electoral votes. And in 48 of the 50 states, whoever gets the majority vote of the people gets 100% of the electoral votes of that state. Only 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, do have a distribution, okay? A distribution, a proportional distribution of states. So now, here we go. Now, my dear friends, let's close it here. Electoral votes formula. What is the formula? It's simple. Each state has a number of delegates, senators and representatives in a Congress. What is the total? California has 53 representatives and 2 senators, therefore 55 delegates. So what do? We take the number 55, and we assign it to California. We say, California, you have 55 electoral votes. So when Californians go and vote, whatever the majority chooses, that majority could be by 1 vote or 2 million votes. Doesn't matter. Whatever the majority of Californians chose, preferred by voting, they order California to elect that person. In other words, California gives that candidate its 55 electoral votes. So we have a total of 538 electoral votes because we gave the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., 3 electoral votes. We did that back in 1972 or so. So who becomes president? Not the one who wins the majority of the people, but who gets the majority of the electoral votes, which is your magic number of 270. So now you'll see what happened in 2016 election. Look at the map. So while Hillary Clinton got more than 3 million Americans voting for her, look at the red here. You become president of the United States by winning 270. Donald Trump had 306 electoral votes. And with that, my friends, I say, here we go. If I want to tease you a little bit, what is at stake in the US Congress? Here's what we have. So don't think only of the president, because then you have all these scenarios. Okay, so currently in the House of Representatives, you have a Democratic majority, 232. All 435 seats are up for election, okay? 198 Republican seats, 232 Democrats. We have one Libertarian, and we have few vacancies. The latest one is the one at the bottom, Representative John Lewis from Georgia. He was one of the great civil rights leaders in this country. You may have heard about his passing away very recently in our country. In the Senate, currently, the Republicans have a majority, 53. So Democrats have 45. There are 2 independents, but these 2 independents tend to vote with the Democrats. They caucus with them in the Senate. So in the November election, there are 33 seats out of these up for election, including more Republican seats, 23, versus 12 Democratic seats. This is to just give you an idea of what is at stake. And with that, I will stop my sharing, and I am at your disposal, my dear friends. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Elias, for this insightful presentation. And I'll invite my colleague, Professor Hayes, to react. So your turn, Bruno.
Okay, thank you, Davson. And thank you all so much for the invitation, this honorable invitation, actually. We at the Federal University of Minas Gerais value this collaboration very much indeed. I will just try to stress a few points, not taking a long time, in the hope of framing a good conversation among us and with our mostly Brazilian audience. First of all, it must be said that Brazil and the US have very different, perhaps opposite starting points. The US was made, as Akram told us, and shown so full of details, of rich details, that, well, historically, this has a root that the United States was made by a bunch of colonies at nowadays the eastern coast of the country, a bunch of colonies that at some point of their rebellion against British colonial power decide to join a union and constitute a federal government. So a coalition of states, despite the fact that after a certain point, many of them didn't have much of a choice anymore. Things are getting ready and a constitution was done and you have to decide. Many states already have gone ahead and you have to decide if you're joined or not, and there's not really much of a choice. But yes, and there was always there are political bickering, and the country was bound to evolve in a Hamiltonian more than Jeffersonian path. And the century, but still, it was pretty much a very uncommon bottom-up process that has left its mark through the centuries. And the peculiarly strong federalism that Akram just showed us in detail. Brazil is quite the opposite. A peculiarly centralized top-down path in our independence, led by the Portuguese equivalent of the Prince of Wales himself, at least partly as a reaction against a revolution that was taking place in Portugal. He had the initial support of 3 key central provinces, Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, Minas Gerais, and prevailed militarily over Portuguese garrisons scattered across the territory, with the support of some British captains. Those are fascinating stories by themselves. But here the most important thing is how those processes tend to shape the institutional design of each of them. In the US, strong layers of institutional powers, as you just heard, surrounded from the start a relatively weak president, the president of a coalition of states, as Akram Elias showed. Not only with federalism, but also the Electoral College, where the states show up as such in the president's election, even to these days. And even the electoral system in itself, perhaps inadvertently, with a majoritarian, winner-takes-all bias that quickly gave birth to strong partisan machines and eventually led to the most enduring partisan duopoly in the whole world. There are a bunch of parties, but yes, you have a kind of a condominium among Republicans and Democrats that is the longest living in the world, with 150 years of alternation just among them. In Brazil, you have just the other way around. Despite the adoption of a constitution from the beginning in 1824, the emperor reserved to himself a fourth branch of government, the moderating power that gave him the last say in the political system. At the beginning, a very centralized empire that gave way to a relatively feeble federalism for most of last century. In the electoral system, after trials with different versions of weak majoritarian systems that allowed for a weak bipartisan, not big partisan system in the 19th century, in the Republic, we have stuck for more than 80 years now with a very perhaps permissive, fragmented electoral system with dozens of seats and hundreds of individual candidacies in each electoral district for many, many parties. And it allows at this point some 30 parties in our lower chamber, and our biggest caucus in Brazil this time have 10% of the seats. Things always go far beyond what is planned. Not the biggest part of all this was never foreseen completely. But it is important to take note of the adaptive nature of institutional innovation. We're always responding to some crisis, to some hardship, to some difficulty with the tools that our tradition laid before us. Like evolution in biology, we can't tell in advance where it goes, but our scenery always relates to our past, to our history. So Brazil, yes, it's a strongly state-centered and federal, if we can say, federally biased system that always had some kind of leadership by the central government. In the United States, despite the circumstance that during the last 200 years, the federal government grows stronger and stronger, still this origin in a true bottom-up process left its mark in the DNA of the country and the institutional DNA, and you have really a very strong federation compared to other countries throughout the world. I will keep myself here, and thank you all, and hope to get a nice conversation in the next minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruno. We've just had two great presentations. We are off to a great Q&A session. And since I've been told I should be switching to Portuguese now, so please allow me to speak now my mother tongue, especially because our audience is made up of mostly Brazilians. Muito obrigado a todos, a todas.
Thank you very much, you all. We will now start our chat, our Q&A, so to speak. It's the best part, I think. We have a few questions incoming, but I would like to, by using the prerogative of a moderator, if I may start this first round of questions by addressing to Akram. Here it goes. There's a concern in the press, in the academia, that there are a few institutional gaps or loopholes that could result into a subversion of the democratic process. For instance, delegates in the electoral colleges would vote against or contrary to what the polls indicate. So how realistic is this kind of forecast or prognostics? Is this an actual possibility or daydream?
A wonderful question. Yeah, of course, first of all, let me say there are always gaps. It's just the nature of things. And whenever one finds a gap, one tries to deal with it. But there's one key thing I want to mention first before answering specifically your question, because it's important to keep in mind as you look at the United States in general, what the founders of the United States struggled with when they were thinking, and it took them from 1776 to 1783, once the British departed, from 1783 to 1789 for 6 years, trying to figure out what system to put together. Because before they established some kind of a confederacy, once we declared our independence, and there was no president, there was only a Congress of states and a president of the Congress. But here's the key point to keep in mind. The system of government in the United States was never conceived nor designed to be a system that solves people's problems. This has always been the world, as they called it, the old world. In other words, throughout history, for millennia, people and nations struggled with establishing systems of government that solves people's problems. And of course, they succeed for a while, but then things change, and then we have to change the structure of government or how to deal with it, etc. So they wanted to come up with something that would not do the same thing. So what they came up with is a systems engineering machine that each and every generation of Americans would have to use to solve their own problems. So in other words, by definition, the machine is constantly evolving. It has main axes that are still pretty much the same: separation of powers, vertically, horizontally, diagonally, checks and balances, and public-private partnerships. In other words, the system is three-legged. There is government, civil society, and the private sector, the free market. The three constantly need to be in balance, and that's what each generation struggles with. So keeping that in mind, every generation is gonna find gaps, and then that's when you add parts to the machine and recalibrate. So speaking specifically about this, well, yes, it has happened, because in the United States, in fact, it addresses also a question that some people may have on there, who are really the electors. In fact, when people are voting for a candidate on election day, they are basically electing the list of electors that nominee, that candidate has selected. Basically, it goes back to the primaries, and those individuals will go cast their vote. Now, honestly, what we have had in our history, yes, we have had, for example, about, from the year 1900, beginning of the 20th century, according to statistics, we've seen maybe about on 9 occasions, okay? Well, the number of, at least one elector, voted for someone differently than the people have voted. In 2016, only 7. Okay, 7 electors voted differently. So what has been happening, talking about the gap since, is that state legislatures are now basically one state after the other. Pretty soon it's going to be pretty much done throughout the union. State legislators are mandating, passing their own laws by saying, you simply have to cast it, period, as it was selected by the people.
Bem, muito bom, muito obrigado. Agora, Bruno, uma pergunta para você, Bruno, do Maurício Pontes.
Bruno, there's a question for you from Mauricio Pontes. Mauricio is asking if during the pandemic, Brazil didn't show anything extra, which is the relative centrality, so to speak, of federative entities, if not the central government. What would you say about it? Well, that's a fascinating topic at the same time that is dramatic, because we're still unfolding. It is a sad story for both our countries, given that, as far as I know, my information update, in the sad county, we're the two topmost countries in the number of deaths in the world. We are large populated countries, but we're not the two most populous countries in the world. We're not. But we are leading in deaths. So in Brazil, there is a relative centralization of our history and a certain social inheritage given the United States. It doesn't mean that the states and municipalities don't have their set of prerogatives. In this case, there has been lots of cases, given the circumstances, in which the Supreme Court has actually started interpreting the law differently, given the lack of organization that the system was responding. And I think this is both valid for here and for the US. In a pandemic, it is very important that the system is well oiled up and be consistent in the response. We did hear, like, if there's a pandemic, let's ask the physicians what to do. But but typically this did prevail, a certain level of unorderly response, at least at first, right off the bat. People and countries did not know what direction to take. The system actually tried to organize in like a military united order, so to speak, because it's what we could have in an emergency like that. Well, in both cases, maybe we could discuss forever and ever. The response has never been coordinated enough, and the system did not respond well enough. That's a fact. In the case of Brazil, I may say that when it seemed that the first measures were taken back in March, starting with airports and shops being shut down, at a certain point, the federal government says, we're going to have a political line of interpretation of the pandemic. They went on national TV and they made a speech. For that, you need lots of consistency and cohesion to believe that the people all the way down to the municipality are going to follow what the federal government is saying. So when you give political interpretation to a decision, this produces effects. This produces effects that different measures that different people are taking to deal personally with a crisis will be interpreted and filtered politically. So, then you have a mess. In this context in which a few states and municipal governments kept the line and the federal government tried to prevent them. So the Supreme Court came and said, no, they are autonomous. States and municipalities are autonomous in making their decisions. And states and municipalities were following WHO, mostly, of the regulations, and I'm sure the Supreme Court would never let the federal government to impose on states and municipalities. So it took a Supreme Court rule, and the federal government discussed this. I'm sure you can disagree, but you have to abide by what a Supreme Court decision has ruled. And I can't even imagine what it would have been if it had been otherwise. The Supreme Court wouldn't have to tell the federal government what to do. It should know already. Therefore, the Supreme Court was, if you will, quote unquote, conservative, preventing the federal government to prevent states and municipalities of acting, if you know what I mean. So the assumption of the conflict, the realm, the foundation, regardless, to the right or to the left, politicians are attached to the institutions and so on. In this specific case, consensus is the best. They should be concerted, harmonic, common diagnosis. People should share the solution instead of dispute politically. So let's leave this when the campaign actually comes. So Akram, Professor Bruno Reis mentioned that Brazil, aside from being a multi-party system, is enormously fragmented. We have lots of parties which are sitting currently in our Congress. But in the United States, and I ask a question on behalf of several people here on the chat, there's like a duopoly, a dominance of two parties, okay, for a long time. That's long-standing, Republicans and Democrats. So why is this so-called hypertrophy of the Republicans and the Democrats? But there's a second question, if I may add. Who are the delegates in the electors? Who are these men and women who represent their states? Who are they?
Wonderful. No, thank you very much. Let me take the second one because that's the easiest one. Basically, we go back to the primaries. So when people are competing in the primaries to get the nomination of the party, because remember, during the primaries, the party, the leadership cannot get involved. People run, they claim the brand of the party. They never ask permission of the leadership of the party. They don't have to. So each one, as they're running during the primaries, they select basically individuals from their brand who will be acting as their delegates. So it's really those actual individuals. That is why usually those people are loyal. That's why you've had only, like, let's say 7 people, who voted, differently. Okay, but they're selected by those. The way that this happens varies from state to state. It's codified by state law. The US government, federal law has nothing to do with that. This is really governed at the state level. So when the person wins, that list of those individuals are expected to cast the vote. When you move now from the primaries to the national, to the general election. So let's say I am one of the candidates now, nominees of one party. So I have my list of 438, basically from, 538 from each state where I have those people. They're ready to go, quote unquote. And basically I win, they go cast the vote. There is talk in this country about really not having them go and cast the vote, period. And the reason for that is that, as I mentioned, the overwhelming majority of states, and pretty soon my prediction is that all the states will mandate. So there'll be absolutely no room left for someone to vote differently. So that is why we can declare, and the media can say basically who has won based on the popular vote in each state, because really them going and casting the vote is more of a pro forma kind of thing rather than something important. So that's how they are. That's who they are. And moving to the first question, however, that is quite interesting. Yes, we have 216 political parties, but as you said, 2 of them have dominated pretty much since the start of the country. There was one party, and I'm going to use an analogy here that you will find funny. Hopefully you'll find funny, and it has to do with soft drinks. So there was one, started as one party, Democratic Republican. So call it the Cola Party, Cola. Then they split into Democrat and Republican. One became Coca-Cola. The second one is Pepsi-Cola. Now we have Fanta, we have Sprite, we have 7-Up, we have hundreds of soft drinks in America. But who dominates the market? Coke and Pepsi. I want you to think market, but for political brands instead of for soft drinks, political brands. Why do I say market? Don't be shocked. There is no membership in political parties in America. If I tell you I'm a Democrat, I'm a Democrat. I don't apply to any Democratic Party. Nobody interviews me. Nobody accepts me or rejects me. I don't pay any dues. I don't have a card. I don't pledge allegiance to anything. I changed my mind. I'm a Republican now. Hey, the citizens in this country choose a brand. So I like Pepsi today. Tomorrow it's Coke. I am Democrat today, tomorrow I'm Republican. In fact, in my state, you can change and call yourself differently. It takes about 60 seconds. You can do it online, okay? Now, so that weakens immediately party structures. So that's why we call it affiliation, not membership. What is your party affiliation? Now, how do you run for office? As I explained, primaries. So now, in the primaries, if I want to run, let's say, for governor of a state as a Republican, I'm not going to seek permission from the leadership of the Republican Party in that state. No, I'm just going to declare it myself. So what do I do now? Why do I run as a Republican in the first place? Well, I ask for the list of the registered voters in my state. People need to register, that's to fight fraud. In the registration process, which varies from state to state, most states ask you a question. And in some states, you don't have to answer it. What is your party affiliation? So if I wrote la la la, I'm la la la. Don't ask me what is la la la. It's irrelevant. So if I pick Democrat, I'm a Democrat now. And I can change that. These lists are made available to the candidates. So I look at the voter registration and I see, for example, 37% call themselves Republican in that state. 26% call themselves Democrat, 5% Green, 2% Socialist. We have from the Nazi to the Communist and everything in between. So I must be stupid to run as a Socialist or a Green when only 2% or 5% claim that brand. So what do I choose? I choose either Coke or Pepsi. Now, it doesn't matter to a large extent. It does matter to a certain extent, but not to a large extent the brand that I choose, because then I'm going to meet with the civil society coalitions of citizens on education, on health, on transportation, if it's a farming area, on agriculture, on this, on that, and see what is it they want. And I need to market myself to them. Two things. When I make a promise, I execute. Okay, so it's very important. You can trust me. I promise I will do my very best. Second, you will never, ever hear a candidate talk about how many PhDs and degrees they have and what great universities they attended, because if they do, they're guaranteed to lose the election. We don't need to elect another PhD. We have all the PhDs in our civil society organizations. So talk to me about leadership. Show me what you've done, what you have done. Have you created jobs? Why should I elect you? Do you understand the economy? Do you know how to build bridges, build consensus if we have divided communities, blah, blah, blah. Show me what you've done, past performance. And if a group, a coalition prefers me, their members will volunteer in my campaign, will raise the funding for my campaign, and will draft the program of the party for that office in partnership with me. So what happens here? The two big brands, because of this process of elections, they keep surveying the market of voters. Where are the voters going? To keep their monopoly on the marketplace, they look at the voters and they start making changes. For example, under the Democratic umbrella, you will hear things like Yellow Dog Democrat, Blue Dog Democrat, Dixie Democrat, Conservative Democrat, Reagan Democrat, New Democrat, Bernie Sanders Democrat, Socialist Democrat. Under the Republican umbrella brand, you're going to hear about Reagan Republicans, Goldwater Republicans, neoconservative Republicans, mainstream Republicans, and now Trumpist Republicans, etc. What is that? Well, it's like Coke, Diet Coke, Coke Zero, Coca Light, huh? Okay, they keep it under Coke. And if it's not enough, Coke buys Sprite. So Sprite is under the Coke umbrella. So what I'm telling you now, you're gonna understand the chaos, what appears to be chaos, okay, for the last several years. This happens every approximately 35 years in America. The two brands become so convoluted, bringing in so many trends under one brand to keep monopoly. When a political recession hits, like in the economy, when a recession hits, these companies that have acquired, mergers and acquisitions have acquired, become big, they have to restructure in order to survive the recession. So every about 35 years, these two big brands when a political recession meaning the American people feel that government is not as responsive to them in the partnership. Okay, people are rebelling. So the two brands have to restructure themselves, shed out and restructure. The Republicans have started the restructuring much sooner and faster because of Trump's aggressive approach in restructuring the party. The Democrats are going through that, and they're going to go through it even more forcefully. But there is no person as aggressive in trying to push it one way or another. So Joe Biden still have to deal with the Bernie Sanders and figure out, should the Bernie Sanders crowd remain under the Democrats or not? How do you restructure, etc.? But this is not new. Look at American history, you'll find it always happening so they can keep their monopoly, because they don't want a multi-party system, coalition type.
Fascinante.
Very pragmatic market approach to politics.
Eu gostei dessa a regulação pelo mercado. Né?
Yes, regulated by the market. Very interesting, your explanation, and also the metaphors are excellent.
Thank you.
I just would like to talk about another aspect of the political system of the United States, and I'm quite fascinated. And I would love to hear Bruno and Akram, which is the judiciary system. We do not talk a lot about it, but it's equally important in the distribution of the powers, interdependent powers. I'd like to hear you about some issues, and then you can choose which approach. For instance, in Brazil, we have a centralized effort. In the Supreme Court, we have our Supreme Court, the Electoral Supreme Court, in order to fight against fake news in the electoral process. I'd like to learn from you, Akram, what is being done in the United States in order to fight fake news. Another question that we have here from our audience, which is quite interesting, what is the advantage of having judges that are voted? In Brazil, they are not voted. They are not directly voted by the population. The judges, they are appointed. And also some of them, they take exams. They need to pass an exam, an entrance exam. So it's merit. It's not democratic, it's meritocratic. So that's how they are selected. And finally, I'd like to hear you about the difficulty that there is nowadays in Brazil and in the United States, keeping the judiciary free from political pressures. Those are similar processes in Brazil and in the US. Politicization of the judicial branch, and if that doesn't hinder the functioning of the judiciary system. I'd like to start from Bruno. Bruno, if you can give us a quick answer, just 3 minutes, and then we hand the floor to Akram. I'd like to start from the fake news. And maybe that's not a very good name. Maybe that's not the best. Rumors were always present of our scenario. What I'm concerned, I'm not sure how to address the problem institutionally speaking, but I'm quite concerned what it seems to be the fragmentation of having one campaign that we would all watch, and we would all watch one public discussion divided in several topics, but with a meaning to us all. The fact that in this moment, the information that we receive are different and they are fragmented according to our interest. And eventually, for this reason, in different groups, it becomes totally different. And for this reason, people are exposed to a set of information, misleading information, decharacterization of one another, in a way that I'm afraid that we are creating an environment for intolerance because of the reduction of the common knowledge in our literature of political science, common law knowledge. Not only I know something, you know that as well, but all of us, we know that all of us know, and so on and so forth. In other words, this common sharing of this knowledge of the rules of the game. And this is one of the requirements of the literature, the tactical coordination. And in this moment, the anticipation. So in other words, people, they are horrified because of this stereotype, each one in one world that is different from what I would like to read. So this has this resonance effects quite concerning. And that's why the electoral system is not so predictable. Maybe less predictable, it wouldn't be a bad thing. The feeling that the electoral system is less predictable in a most polarized way, more aggressive, more receptive to violence. So I just wanted to address this aspect, and I do not know the solution for this problem, but we're all sharing the same problem. And the characteristics of the judiciary in the American system, I will not address. So I hand the floor to Akram so he can address the topics regarding the judiciary in the US.
Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts, Bruno. I think it's great that you made a distinction with fake news and you said rumors. As a student of the American system, you know, when people in my country ask me, say, "Oh my God, we have never seen anything like that. This is horrible. What's happening in our country?" I said, you know, that's the problem when people don't read history or study it. And we're supposed to study history in order to illuminate us, to give us an idea about what was happening before, not to repeat it, learn from it, and move forward. We had only one election that was not really dirty, and I mean people using all kinds of bad language against one another, coming up with fake news, like this person had an illegitimate relation and had, you know, this children here and there, and liars and thieves, and you name it. Only one, it was George Washington. Once we were through with George Washington, starting with John Adams, moving forward, we've always had that. And when the press, oh my God, if you go back and read the press of those days, I mean, so here's one thing that I would like to add to what you said and give it some context. That's my perspective. The major difference with what's happening today in our world is that we are bombarded with information 24 hours, nonstop, 7 days a week. So that is the difference. It's the attacks have always existed. It's now we are much more aware of them. They're in our face. In other words, it's getting to a point where there's absolutely no more space for an individual to distance herself or himself from what's happening in the world. In an elevator, you have the the screen of the television giving you the news. You go to the bathroom now, look in bathrooms, they're hitting you with the news. And of course, let's not forget social media. Your phone is like, and I said, why did I ask for these things? So I do a lot of leadership training for young people, for our democracy. One of the key areas that I focus on is how to teach young women and men to distance themselves, to take space, separate from this busy, noisy world so they can focus a little bit on themselves, learn to appreciate silence. We should not have noise constantly. Humans need periods of silence so they can meditate internally, assimilate internally what is happening, rather than just being bombarded and figuring out what is right, what is fake, what is new. If one centers oneself, it becomes easier. And one is in harmony with oneself. With that, it becomes easier to see what makes more sense, what makes no sense. But if they're constantly busy, they get lost. So having said that, this is the world in which we live. I think the new generation, which is rising with this kind of 24-hour news, will find the equilibrium. We are struggling with it because it's a period of transition. The new generation will find its center somehow. Now, there's a big difference with our system, however. The courts have, including federal courts, have very little, if anything, to say. Because in the United States, the founders of the country adopted 5 natural rights. Natural. In other words, it has nothing to do with democracy. It's not we, the people, who voted because we're democratic and we get to give one another those rights. Those democratic rights are like civil rights, like all kinds of rights. But there are 5 natural rights that to the founders of the United States, they were given, endowed by the Creator, untouchable by the people. And those include freedom of speech, freedom of the press. That's why we cannot ban hate speech in America. That's why civil society becomes so important, to counter hate. So we hit on how do we counter misperceptions? How do we counter ignorance? How do we educate one another? And why we push diversity so people can start working, because we don't have a choice. We cannot make laws. So the First Amendment, that is Article 1 of the Bill of Rights, does not say citizens have the right to freedom of speech. It says Congress shall make no law. So the courts uphold that. That's the role of the courts. You can't censure. So they keep saying all kinds of lousy things. The courts have their hands pretty much tied. It is up to citizens to assume responsibility and to create the balance and counter hate, counter these forms of extremism, which can be empowered through free speech, freedom of the press, etc. Now, on the judiciary, states and local governments, why do they have a lot of judges elected? Well, you see, the big fundamental rights are really in the federal constitution. So I'll leave the federal judiciary to the end. Let me just address that quick thing about the state and local governments. There are 2 philosophies. Under our system, as you know, we took it from the English tradition. So it's based on our jurisprudence operates differently. It's really people. People make the laws through their government officials, lawmakers, in partnership with them. So if somebody violates the law, it is violating basically what the consensus of the people wanted. Therefore, the people should say, is this person guilty or not? And what should be the penalty? So we adopted that jury system. So basically, jurors are speaking to that. The role of judges, primarily in these cases, the role of judges is to be the referee, to make sure that everybody's respecting the game. It's basically, you have the district attorney on the one hand, and then the defense attorney on the other hand. They're trying to present evidence, etc., to the jurors. The jurors don't have to know anything about the law. It's all about common sense. Do they believe the evidence or they don't? And they need to agree to it. So for that, people feel judges in some schools, in some states, people feel if we elect the judges, we make them more accountable to be the good referees. In other states, they say, no, it's better to be appointed. 2 different schools. But where the debate was in the founding of the country was not about those at the state level, was to secure the big rights. We have a Bill of Rights. This is very important. We have a federal constitution with the machine describing the axes of the machine that I told you about. Those to the founders should be almost untouchable. In other words, very, very, very difficult to mess with. And who are the guardians? Welcome to the federal judiciary. So here's the idea. All federal judges are appointed for life, not just simply the Supreme Court. All federal judges. Primary courts, we call them US district courts. The courts of appeal, we call them US circuit courts, and the US Supreme Court. All of them are appointed for life. And what's the idea behind it? It's simple. The process of the appointment is political. So this addresses the third question, the difficulty. You know, how do we protect these judges from political pressures? At the federal level, this is the leap of faith that the founders did, and we're still working with it. And it has worked pretty well so far, I must say, okay? Pretty well. Not 100%, but pretty well. Let me explain. Human nature. When somebody sits in a chair of authority, like a judge, knowing that she or he can no longer be removed from office, from that chair, because of her opinions or his decisions. Ooh, they have total immunity when it comes to their decisions and opinions. Nobody's above the law. If a federal judge is corrupt, violates the law, the Congress of the states has that same power to impeach the judge, remove him or her from office the same way they remove the president. But the president is expected to be pressured politically. We don't want judges pressured politically. So the idea is, although the process is political, the president nominates a Senate, whatever the majority is. Like now, there is this big debate, you know, for the replacement of our, excuse me, Justice Bader, who passed away. The president wants to nominate, the Senate is ready to move. It happens to be the same party, they want to do it. It's political. No matter the process is political, the idea is once that person sits in the chair, if people try to pressure him or her after being appointed, they tend to double down and become more independent. That explains to you why it was an appointee by Nixon who basically caused his downfall with Watergate. This is human nature. It's not perfect, but we know. That's the pragmatism again, you know, not the utopia, the pragmatism. Humans are humans. And when somebody knows, I owe you, maybe you appointed me, I'm thankful to you, but now that I'm here, you can no longer pressure me. Thank you very much. Don't try to tell me I appointed you, because if you do, I'm gonna double down on you. That's human nature. So we are betting on that. It's not perfect, but here we go. That's how we try to guard against the political pressure. So people can protest as much as they want in front of the Supreme Court for something or against something, and they've been doing it forever. It doesn't matter. Those justices do not care really what the people protesting. They care about two philosophies, and now understand why this appointment is so very important. There are two philosophies for our courts.
Eu quero só registrar que há uma avalanche de perguntas.
I want to mention there's like a waterfall of questions coming. It's an avalanche of questions. And let me say on the quality of your answers and how hard it is for me to choose which question to ask. We're running out of time, but I want to make good use of your time. One last round of questions, if you allow me.
Please.
So one thing that comes up is to do with the U.S. electoral process this year. People are voting via the post office or voting analogic, as we call analog ballots, because in Brazil we use electronic ballots, you know? So why do you not vote electronically in the U.S.? That's one question. There's a question from our host. Our hostess is asking, why the U.S. vote on the first Tuesday of November? If you know, there might be an answer for that. I'm sure there is. And maybe you can talk about these two things.
Sure, I'm gonna play ball here, and I'm gonna throw it maybe to Julie and see if she knows why it is the first Tuesday. I know it's been a long tradition with us. It has changed. It hasn't been always November. I mean, when the country was founded, it was in March. Then we switched to January. Then I think it was April. I don't remember really when we went to the November thing, but it is definitely structured. In other words, we passed some kind of law to do that, but honestly, I haven't looked at why and how that first Tuesday in November comes in. So my apologies. I'll try to figure it out. If I find something interesting, I'll send it to Professor Lopez, and maybe you can pass it along. On the voting, it really varies from state to state. Well, I'll give you an example. My wife and I, she decided we have the choice. We have the choice, including the electronic ballot. So I'm voting electronically. She's voting by mail. She just received the ballot yesterday. I received the notification electronically. So it really varies, and people have the choice. This year, because of the whole COVID situation and how people giving access to as many people to vote, in other words, for people to really have the chance to exercise their right to vote, states are doing different things. The state of Ohio, they're saying, for example, we're going to mail ballots to everybody. And they're putting mailboxes in all kinds of locations to facilitate for people to drop that. But everywhere there is electronic balloting in one shape, form, or another. States are experimenting in different ways because of our non-centralized system I described earlier. So even when it comes to doing federal elections, like members of Congress and the president, it is states that control most of the laws and regulations governing those elections. But you do have the choice. It just varies from place to place.
Ok. Eu acho que assim nós vamos nos aproximando do fim da sessão. Eu quero agradecer.
All right, like that, we're very close to the end. Thank you very much, Akram and Bruno, for your greatest company here today. I learned a lot.
Thank you. Thank you all, and thank you for having me be with you. I know it's never enough time. I hope what I shared with you will be somewhat useful, will trigger more thoughts for more exchanges, and thank you very much, Dr. Lopez and Bruno, Dr. Rice. Thank you very much also for taking part in this, and I just appreciate it. Thank you so much.
E eu também gostaria de agradecer a nosso palestrante, Akram Elias.
I also want to thank you, our dear speaker, Akram Elias.
Momento. Momento. Thank you.
Just a second. And our debater, Professor Bruno Reis as well, and our moderator, Professor Davison Lopez. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here today. And you all have a good evening.
Obrigada a todos. E a palestra vai estar.
Thank you all. The speech will be at congressme.com webpage, and certificates are also going to be sent to you all. Thank you all for your participation. Bye-bye now.